Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm the author of the 10 Year in Academy series, and this is English Nerd. So today I am really excited and privileged to get to talk to Dr. John Freeh, who is the director of the Newman Institute. He's also an experienced professor of Renaissance literature, particularly Shakespeare. So I am super excited to pick his brain about Shakespearean things, particularly Hamlet, because as many of you already know, that is my favorite Shakespeare play. So thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me.
Carly, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you after to think back on our time in Hillsdale. So good to be here with you today.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just to kind of dive right in, I had some questions for you. I have taught Hamlet for many years, but one of the great things about Shakespeare is that there's always more to discover. And so as I'm kind of in the background getting ready to write my own retelling of Hamlet, I'm finding that I have all these questions, and you seemed like a really good place to start asking those. So my first question is about Shakespeare's relationship with his own source material. Obviously, his histories and some of his other works come from something else. So what can you tell me about his relationship to his sources?
Sure, that's a good question. It's a vast question. Shakespeare has been called someone with a magpie intellect. In other words, he was able to focus in on every resource available to him. T.S. Eliot once says of him that he picked up more in his sort of reading and ranging about than one could by sitting in the British Museum for weeks and months on end. Mm. What's interesting in Shakespeare, I think, is his creative use of his resources. He takes old plays, he looks at them, and then depending on what's on his heart and mind, he will feel free to change and sometimes change radically because of a particular thematic approach that he has. So he will rely on the source material, sometimes multiple source material for the same plays, but the end result is always characteristically Shakespeare, based on what he wishes to transmit to his viewer, to his listener.
So he used the sources more as inspiration for what he really wanted to get across?
I think so. Or, I mean, he respects the sources, but there are particular aspects of human nature or of thought or of philosophy which he's interested in, he's working out in his own mind. So he may go on, he may start with a foundational character, say in a play like Julius Caesar, and he will, because of something that he's thinking about, the passage of time or the nature of tyranny, he will develop that. He will extrapolate from that. And it's interesting. It's a great, I always say it's a great pursuit of study for anyone interested in Shakespeare, to look at the source material and then to read the Shakespeare play and then to ask the question, well, what is Shakespeare adding? What is he subtracting? What is he doing different?
Yeah, that's one of the areas where I feel like I'm honestly most ignorant about Hamlet. I know the play itself, I think, pretty well, but the source material I have a little bit of knowledge of, but not very much.
Sure.
What do you know about the origins of Hamlet?
It's been a while. I know there are Old Norse legends based on a character similar to Hamlet. There's an Hamlet source in the background material, and then as you said earlier in your correspondence to me, there's what's going on in contemporary Renaissance Europe, especially with respect to what's happening in the Reformation, that moves into the center stage when Shakespeare's writing of the play. The mention is there, of course, of where Hamlet studies, the Wittenberg, which is where, of course, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Thesis to the church door. as I mentioned, in Paris, the University of Paris, where Laertes is studying. So all of these things are in the background, and the more that we know the historical context of that play, in addition to the source materials, I think the fuller picture we get of what Shakespeare is trying to do.
Nice. So you feel that he brought in a lot of his own time then into Hamlet. I know that some people look at his source material and say, oh, well, the play must be set in the year 1000 or something like that. But it seems to me that it feels, I mean, I could be wrong. It seems to me that it feels more Renaissance, like his own time, but sort of an alternate version of it.
I think you're right, Carly. I think it's clearly philosophically and thematically the setting is clearly early modern. For instance, the whole debate between Horatio and Hamlet on the nature and function of reason. That back and forth is a typical early modern debate with the growth of rationalism. And here is Hamlet reaching beyond the strictly rational and saying to Horatio, chiding him, there are things undreamt of in your philosophy. And that really speaks to a controversy that's starting to heat up at the beginning of the 17th century and will continue.
I hadn't thought about it from that angle. I mean, I love that line, but I always took it from my own experience and kind of went from there. Oh, that's awesome. So my next question was kind of related also to his own time, and that has to do with rulership at the time. Obviously, in Hamlet, we have the battle for the throne kind of as a backdrop for everything that's happening. Claudius killing his brother to get the throne, and then the question of, well, would Hamlet be a better ruler than Claudius if he actually managed to get on the throne? So what were some qualities of a good leader in Shakespeare's time?
Sure. In about a century earlier, not quite a century, Erasmus of Rotterdam writes a treatise on the education of a Christian prince, and in that treatise, Erasmus lists some of the qualities expected in a leader, and they come down to the various virtues: justice, temperance, self-dominion, compassion for one's subjects. And if we look at the plays in Shakespeare dealing with kings, either the history plays or more contemporaneous to Hamlet, King Lear, we see those qualities or virtues echoed and repeated. So obviously, from the get-go, a figure like Claudius is driven by ambition and by lust and by dishonesty. He does not really live up to Shakespeare's idea of a good ruler, of a good prince, Christian prince. But ironically, Hamlet himself has his own limitations. I think one thing to keep in mind is that probably since the Romantic period, the character of Hamlet has been elevated. Comparing him to Claudius, he's seen as the one who's interested in justice, which he is, the one who hates corruption, which he does. But there are elements of Hamlet that call into question his own integrity. So those last lines of the play, where Horatio says more or less, now cracks a noble heart, he would have proved most royal to have been put on. I think there's a bit of irony in there when you go back and when you really look at what Hamlet does. Like most of Shakespeare's characters, he's not a stick figure. He has his good points and his virtues, but he also has his vices. And Shakespeare, I think, does bring them out. But a post-romantic view of Hamlet sort of misses that unless they delve deeply into the particulars of the text.
Yeah, it's true that certainly at the beginning he had a good reason to be going after Claudius,
Yes.
But it's true. I think that there is irony in saying that he would have proved most royal, because the closer I look at the play, the more issues that I see with him. I don't think he would have made as good a ruler, even as his own people thought that he would.
Yes.
He's talked about as being very popular.
He was much loved. That's apparent. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's his youth and his. I mean, he's a Renaissance man. He's a scholar, a thinker, but also a soldier.
Right. Super charismatic.
There are problems.
Yes. So one of those, it's a perfect segue, in fact. One of those is his treatment of Ophelia, which is just not even defensible. It doesn't make any sense. I understand his anger toward his mother, of course,
yes.
Although he takes it very far. But the way that he treats Ophelia is it's indefensible. The first time we see him pretending to be insane is privately with her, and from then on it just kind of goes south, of course. So I wanted to know your take on Shakespeare's view of masculinity and femininity, if that was kind of representative of what was accepted at the time, or if it was seen as reprehensible then. Just some, I know it's a big question as well, but some
sure.
broad strokes thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, to start with Ophelia, yes, you're absolutely right. He feels deeply betrayed by what his mother has done, and then frailty thy name is woman. But he then, despite his intelligence, and he is intelligent, he extrapolates from that one sort of bad experience and seems to then view women universally in a bad sense. He's a little bit like, if you recall Homer's Iliad, the character of Agamemnon, who's killed by his wife Clytemnestra, and we come upon him in the underworld, and he tells Ulysses, he tells Odysseus, never trust any woman because of his own experience. So Hamlet tends to be I think unwise in his treatment of Ophelia, and certainly cruel. I mean, it is indefensible, as you say. In terms of to understand your question, Carly, are you asking whether Shakespeare himself or his audience would have been less critical than we are with how he treats Ophelia? Or
I'm going to assume that they would be less critical to a degree than we are. My question was more, what were some of the roles that, like, what did the roles look like
sure.
with men and women, and did Shakespeare seem to align with the general norms?
I think he would have aligned with the general norms about expectations of what a man ought to do in order to fulfill his masculinity, and likewise a woman. But all you need do is go to the many female characters in Shakespeare, to see that it's also informed by this sense of a deep nobility, both of male and female. It's part of his Christian humanism. And you see that especially in the late plays of Shakespeare, where the female characters are given great prominence, and become vehicles for forgiveness and compassion and grace and wisdom. So in that sense, I think he would have been not as closely aligned with the conventions of his time with respect to women, his women who have integrity, who have strength, and indeed who have wisdom, perhaps over and above what Shakespeare's contemporaries might have imagined or conceived.
Yeah, one thing I do appreciate about Shakespeare is that even though, of course, he doesn't have the fully modern sensibility of equality, you still feel that the female characters are people. They're not just these, idealized or demonized, kind of stand-in figures. They have depth to them, and yeah. So
Exactly. There's a real richness and fullness of, you think of a Portia in the Merchant of Venice. You think of Miranda in the Tempest. There's a fullness, a richness to them, a beauty. And while Shakespeare clearly is aware of the differences of gender, uh, he's not confused about those differences. He he delves down in the case of both men and women to what is essential in human nature, and therefore he treats good men and good women with tremendous deference and respect. And there's a beauty there of humanity, a kind of perfected humanity, which he clearly admires.
yeah, so he does clearly respect those good people with high integrity and all of that. Um, but of course, we see mostly really broken people in Shakespeare. One thing that I've noticed is that it seems like a man is viewed as evil if they do something that is truly, undeniably evil, like Claudius killing his brother for the throne. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I was wondering what else could actually ruin a man's reputation. A woman's reputation is talked about quite a lot. It's
Right,
normally, having sex outside of marriage, whether before or during.
right.
But with men, it seems like they can have different vices, but their reputations are not necessarily tarnished by that. And so I was wondering what would be enough, short of doing something very extreme, that might
Sure.
ruin a man's reputation.
I think, and this is across the board in the 37 or so odd plays. I think duplicity in Shakespeare on the part of men, also women, uh, but duplicity on the part of a man is clearly something that diminishes his goodness. There's that great scene in King Lear where Kent is fighting with the foppish character Oswald, and he says more or less that when the fight is broken up by the Duke of Cornwall, he says more or less that he's angry that such a man should wear a sword, should be a knight, in other words, that wears no honesty in his heart.
Hmm.
There's a disconnect there. Um, so, um, so the importance of sincerity and truth is really one of the things that defines or separates those who are struggling to be good and those who have surrendered to the vice of dishonesty out of ambition or cruelty or convenience. So honesty, I think, is an area where one can lose their standing in Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, interestingly, his is clearly a moral universe. I mean, um, he rewards goodness dramatically, and he punishes vice dramatically. And there's a kind of consistency in Shakespeare if you know all of the plays and all of the characters. What's interesting in Hamlet with respect to both Laertes and Hamlet himself is they have good points. They have valor, certainly. They're courageous. But Laertes himself, by the end, he acknowledges his treachery, and he acknowledges that his conscience is being bothered by that treachery of poisoning the edge of the sword.
Mm-hmm.
And Hamlet is not as aware of his vices. I think one of the most horrific scenes in Shakespeare is when um, he comes upon Claudius praying, trying to repent. He doesn't repent,
Mm-hmm.
and he refrains from killing him. Why? He says, "Pat, now might I do it, Pat?" No, and then he refrains from killing him from behind. He says, "Up, sword, and no, a more horrid hent." He doesn't merely want his death. He wants the second death of damnation. he does the same to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
That's true. He says
Changes
no,
the
give him no
letters.
shriving time allowed.
No shriving time allowed.
Man.
That's wicked.
Well, especially just for a moment, especially with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. I mean, you could argue that they were a little, it's not great that they took money from the king and queen, but assuming that
they're weak characters.
But yeah, right? I mean, they're weak characters, but good lord, they did not deserve. They did not deserve that, and like nobody can even argue that they did. No. It's those few pages. It's Ophelia's funeral, followed by the admitting to the deaths of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. That is the lowest point for Hamlet.
Yeah. Yes.
The love-hate relationship that I have with him.
I mean, both of them at the point of death, both of them acknowledge, they ask forgiveness and receive forgiveness, but they lack. I think they lack what Shakespeare would say as a consistent integrity because of those actions, Laertes and Hamlet.
Yeah, the reason that I asked actually was, if you recall, Polonius tells his servant to investigate Laertes' behavior in Paris. Right. Is he behaving himself? And the way that they're going to find that out is by accusing him of just wildly of all these things. and if anything sticks, if everybody goes, oh yeah, that's Laertes, then of course he's guilty of those things. But I was thinking to myself, if somebody said, oh yeah, no, Ophelia was running around with so-and-so, then that would just be the end for her. And so I was wondering where was that line for guys?
Certainly there was you could say, and that's been true throughout most of history. There was something of a double standard in terms of what was accepted or acceptable, but nonetheless, you'll recall that who's the character that Ronaldo. No? Mm-hmm. Ronaldo is the character that Polonius sets to spy on his son. Ronaldo himself is saying, I don't want to do anything that will dishonor him.
Right.
And it's Polonius, the foolishness of Polonius, who says, no, keep driving home till you get to the bottom of who my son is. By finding things out by indirection. It also raises the dynamic of this is the father of Laertes, and he himself is deeply flawed, despite the good sounding counsel that he gives. And so Laertes has grown up with Polonius as a role model. but Laertes
he managed to rise above that, I think.
He does. I think he has more integrity because he's the one who counsels his sister. Be careful of Hamlet. Make sure that his protestations of love are real. And when she says to him, more or less, well, I hope you're following your own advice, and he says, yes, of course I am. Don't worry about that. So I think his faults lie not so much in that area, but rather in a kind of anger, which issues in the desire to revenge. I think that's his fault, as I see it.
So just I have one more major question for you.
Sure.
If I remember correctly, when you were my professor, you had seen an adaptation of every single Shakespeare play. There was one outstanding that you were looking for. Yes. So you've seen tons of different productions of Shakespeare, yes. And I was wondering what are some things? Yeah, right. Some good.
Many not so good.
Yeah. So what distinguishes a good adaptation from a poor one?
Well, some people say, purists say that you have to, as best you can, sort of study the text carefully, understand it, study the stage direction, and follow it slavishly, as it were. I don't think that's quite the right approach because there is some flexibility that Shakespeare gives, and also you're talking about human characters and personality, So there could be other aspects of that personality which a director or an actor could bring to the fore without doing an injustice to Shakespeare. The real problem comes in when directors or actors um, don't don't know don't know Shakespeare, don't understand him, or I guess even worse, have a particular narrow sort of worldview or an ideological or political agenda, which they then end up simply imposing on the text in order to make a point. You know? And you see that more and more, the combined ignorance of a line in Shakespeare or a character in Shakespeare, combined or complemented with a kind of ideology which attempts to use Shakespeare as a kind of proof text for whatever political or ideological point they're trying to make. And if you know Shakespeare well, you end up in seeing such productions, you wince because you realize that they've missed the point entirely. But then again, there's a whole school of actors and directors who would say, well, we don't care. It's kind of a reader response. This is what it means to us, and this is how we wish to present it. But I think then you're not presenting Shakespeare. You're telling us more about you, the director, and your beliefs and values, or the actor's beliefs and values, than you are about Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's understanding of human nature is it's unfailingly good. You know, Dryden says of him that of all poets, ancient and modern, Shakespeare had the most comprehensive soul. He really understood human nature, and that's the value that he has for us as viewers and readers, I think.
So you're of the opinion that Shakespeare is in that way because of his observation of human nature universal, and adaptation should reflect that universality instead of making it more.
I think so. I think there might be some occasions in certain historical situations, and I'm sure this happened it happened in totalitarian systems. It happened in Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany, where a director or an actor might seize on something in Shakespeare that really speaks to their own situation, and they might then emphasize those aspects of the play, and I could see that working and being interesting. But Shakespeare has so much to offer in his again comprehensive view of human nature that it would be a shame to simply disregard that. I mean, the proof of Shakespeare being comprehensive is that virtually, since he's touched on every aspect of the human experience, you could go through Shakespeare, comb through the works of Shakespeare as a feminist or as a Marxist or as an anti-colonialist, and you could pick out sections which would allow you to form a kind of treatise, and then say, well, here's Shakespeare, the proto-Marxist, or Shakespeare, the original proponent of feminism, so on and so forth. Precisely because he deals with everything, you know. So, yeah.
That's interesting. So your least favorite thing is just the narrowing to one ideology and kind of marrying Shakespeare, associating him with just one kind of modern idea, rather than.
And because then it's what you're doing. You're taking something grand and great and universal, and there's a kind of reductionism there. And can a story be told through that reductionism? Well, perhaps, but then you're missing the fullness of what Shakespeare has to offer, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. It does. So do you have any advice for me as I'm doing a different type of adaptation, of course,
Sure.
But especially in terms of themes? So I'm going to stick not super closely to the text because I don't think that would make sense with what
Right.
I'm doing. It'll be a lot of touch points to the different lines and whatnot, but I want to make sure that the themes and the characters and some of those things ring true
Sure.
throughout. So what are some of the themes that you think are most important to retain?
So are you referring now to the play as a whole, or to Laertes, or?
Well, either one really.
Sure. I think the first. I mean, obviously, this uh, there's so much in the play subsurface and indeed close to the surface, dealing with the question of eternity, damnation, and salvation, heirs from heaven, blessed from hell. It's so the idea of the ultimate destiny of the human person is clearly very much on Shakespeare's mind when he writes this. There's the theme of revenge, where Hamlet and Laertes take upon themselves the job of avenging injustices that real or perceived that have been done to them, and that needs to be considered over and against the backdrop of Christian understandings of revenge, where in the Old Testament God says, "Vengeance is mine," or even elsewhere in Shakespeare, in The Tempest, where the character of Prospero struggles, should he avenge injustices done to him? And he says, by way of resolution at the end of the play, the rarer action, the better action is in virtue than in vengeance. Vengeance is tempting, and it's a perfectly understandable human reaction, but ultimately Shakespeare comes down on the side of restraining vengeance. So that's obviously a theme to be considered. The whole question of the nature of language and manifesting what you really believe, what's in your heart, as opposed to duplicity, seeming, covering up. And Polonius is a master of indirection. Conscience, right? How conscience works. It's the motive for Hamlet having those lines added to the mousetrap to see. He hears that those with a guilty conscience, on seeing something related to their crime, will react negatively, and of course Claudius does. So conscience, different understandings of conscience. At one point, you'll recall Hamlet says when he's not acting, not avenging his father, he says, "Conscience doth make cowards of us all." Well, there's a curious sort of understanding, perhaps misunderstanding of conscience, rightly understood. So I think those are certainly some of the main concerns that Shakespeare comes back to again and again in the play from different angles and different perspectives.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, as soon as you said each one of those, of course, I thought, well, right, here, and there. There, it's very prominent. But of course, when you read something over and over and you teach it over and over, it's easy to sort of get like, well, here's my understanding of it, and I know that there's more, but this is what I tend to focus on, and so it's helpful to get another perspective to kind of just open my mind to look at other things.
In your teaching of it, Carly, and coming back to it, and there are other themes as well. Are there other ones that I haven't mentioned that seem to resonate with you?
So when I teach it, I realize it's an incomplete list, obviously, of different themes, but can only focus on so much. We talk about what does it mean to be human. There are a couple of monologues in particular that talk about and soliloquies that talk about whether mankind is just a beast, or if they really have this angelic potential. What is mankind really? So we talk about that quite a bit. Just life and death, kind of the almost the merits of both. That's not quite the right way to put it, but those are always being juxtaposed against one another, and Hamlet is throughout most of the play struggling with, to be or not to be, and so we talked about that. And thought versus action as well. When should you stop overanalyzing an act, and when should you not act rashly and you should stop and analyze? Right. Because I'm not of the opinion that Hamlet's tragic flaw is indecision. I think he starts out pretty indecisive, but obviously by the end that's not his problem.
Exactly,
he runs out and just starts, just sword swinging. So
that's right.
Those are three that we.
I think those are all good. Yeah, those are all also sort of fertile areas to explore. Mm-hmm. And again, Shakespeare. The brilliance of Shakespeare is he will in a given play, in a narrative, it's as if his mind is so active, so fertile that he will bring into the plays what's been on his mind. It's often helpful to read the plays that are written around the same time. You see that he's working with some of the same ideas, some of the same themes. But no, he's fascinated by the human person. He says famously in here, as a pushback to reductionism, he says to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, he's offended by the thought that they would attempt to pluck out his mystery. And he's saying that, I think, in defense of what is mysterious within the human heart, not just for himself, but for all human beings. There's that line from Proverbs, how tortuous is the human heart, who can understand it? And I think Shakespeare would have fully subscribed to that idea, that there's a mystery in the human person that goes beyond what can be seen and measured. And I think that's a sign of his wisdom with respect to the human experience.
All right. Well, that's a beautiful place to end, and we've already gone a little past the time that I said. So I want to respect you and just call it here. But again, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me and answer some of my questions. It's been really nice to reconnect with you as well. That's been definitely a highlight of my day. So
you're welcome. It's been a pleasure, Carly. Thanks for talking about Shakespeare with me.
Always. All right. Well, make sure to like this video if you like it. Subscribe for more English nerdy goodness, and I'll see you on Monday. Bye.